The night of the Hargrove Foundation gala, Cecily Marsh almost didn't go. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror for 22 minutes. She knew because she'd watched the clock, the way you watch something you're hoping will save you, and stared at the emerald dress hanging on the back of the door. It was a good dress. She knew it was a good dress. Her best friend Tara had picked it out 3 weeks ago, had zipped it up and said, "You look devastating," with the kind of conviction that only people who've never had to fight for it can muster. Cecily had nodded and said, "Thank you," and hung the dress up and spent the next 3 weeks thinking of excuses not to wear it. But tonight was the fundraiser for the Children's Literacy Foundation she'd spent 4 years building from a one-room program into something real. Her name was on the printed programs. Her face was in the slide deck. She was going. She smoothed the silk over her hips, slid on her heels, and told her reflection something she almost believed. You are allowed to take up space. The ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel looked the way money always looked. Effortless, chilled, slightly cruel. Crystal chandeliers threw light across a sea of angular shoulders and flat stomachs, and Cecily moved through it the way she always moved through rooms like this, efficiently, quietly, with her chin up just enough to signal that she belonged, even when every prickling nerve in her body was whispering otherwise. She had spent most of her adult life in rooms that weren't built for her. Not physically, she understood that, but it was subtler than door frames. It was the way eyes slid over you at a networking event, the way a compliment about your work always arrived with a slight pause before it, like the person was doing math. She had learned not to take up more space than she was given. She was working on unlearning that. The literacy program had an entire table near the front, full of donors and board members who greeted her warmly, who held her hands when she arrived and said, "Cecily, you look wonderful with genuine brightness." She smiled and meant it back. This part, the work, the people who believed in the work, this was why she had put on the dress. She didn't notice him until the cocktail hour. He was standing near the windows, separated from the clusters of conversation by a foot of empty space that no one seemed willing to cross. Tall, dark jacket, no tie. His watch caught the light when he raised his glass. He wasn't doing what everyone else in the room was doing, performing. He was simply watching, with the patience of someone who had learned that the room would eventually come to him. Cecily looked away. She looked back. He was already looking at her. She felt heat rush to the back of her neck and turned toward the bar. She was 3 sentences into a conversation about donor matching when she heard the voice, "Cecily." She turned, and there was Derek Lowe, her ex. 18 months gone, or so she'd thought, until apparently he'd been invited to the same fundraiser by someone on the board she hadn't thought to cross-reference. He looked exactly the way he'd always looked. Well-tailored, well-lit, aggressively confident in the way of men who had been told they were exceptional for so long they had confused it with fact. "Derek." She kept her voice level. "I didn't know you'd be here. Elaine Fowler invited me." He said it lightly, the way you say things when you want them to land a little heavier than they sound. Elaine Fowler, who sat on the foundation board, who wrote checks with a lot of zeros. "You look..." He tilted his head, that old familiar gesture, and let his eyes move down and back up. Well, there was a pause in that sentence. She had lived inside that pause for 3 years of their relationship. It was where he kept his real opinions. "Thank you," she said, because she'd learned not to hand him the rope. "Still doing the reading thing?" He picked up a canapé from a passing tray, unhurried. "I always thought it was sweet, probably more of a calling than a career. There it is." She had almost missed how precise he was with it. Never loud enough to cause a scene. Just enough to leave a bruise. "The foundation's operating budget is 4 times what it was when I started," she said. "We've reached 60,000 kids in 3 years. But yes, calling works." Something shifted in his face. He didn't like math that outran him. "You always were sharp." He said it the way you'd say it about a dog that had learned a trick. "I heard you've been going to all these society things now." His gaze moved over her again, and this time he let it linger just long enough to be deliberate. "I think it's great. I do. It's Brave. Not everyone would. He stopped, smiled. Well, you know what I mean. She did know. That was the problem. She felt the familiar compression start in her chest, that old familiar going small, and she was halfway through swallowing it when a voice came from directly behind her left shoulder. Mrs. Marsh. She turned. It was the man from the window. Up close he was, quieter than she'd expected. Not warm, exactly, but precise in the way that implied nothing he did was accidental. His dark eyes moved from her face to Derek's and back, and something in them told her he had heard enough. "Forgive the interruption," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, a voice that knew how to make a room lean in. "I've been trying to reach you all evening. I have some questions about the Foundation's rural expansion program." She blinked. Of course. He offered his hand to Derek with the polite neutrality of a man who had already made his assessment and found the result uninteresting. "Callum Vane." Derek shook it. Callum Vane gave him exactly 2 seconds of eye contact, then turned back to Cecily as though Derek had already ceased to exist. "Could I borrow you for a few minutes?" He said it like he was asking. His eyes said something else. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely." He walked her toward the far end of the room, near the floor-to-ceiling windows, and said nothing until they were out of earshot. Then, "He does that often?" She turned to look at him. "Excuse me." The pauses. Callum Vane kept his eyes on the room, not on her, which somehow made it easier to hear. The way he talks, every sentence with one too many of them. She was quiet for a moment. "We dated for 3 years. He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected. "You didn't actually have questions about the rural expansion program," she said. "I have 17 questions about the rural expansion program." He looked at her then. "I've read your last 4 annual reports. I was going to introduce myself anyway." She studied him. Callum Vane. She ran it through her memory. Donor roles, board connections, foundation research. Nothing, which meant either he was new money or the kind of old money that didn't need to be on lists. "You're not on any of our donor records," she said. "Not yet," he said it simply. "I'm deciding. On whether to donate. On whether the foundation is worth my attention." He let that sit for a moment, then, "I've been watching you work the room for 45 minutes, Ms. Marshish. You know every person's name. Board member's daughter who just got into Michigan, the donor whose husband had surgery last month. You run toward the hard conversations instead of away from them." He paused. "Then that man walks over, and you spend 30 seconds trying to make yourself smaller." Her chin came up. "I don't make myself small." "No," he agreed. "You caught yourself. That's different." He turned slightly toward her. "I'm Callum Vane. My firm focuses on educational infrastructure investment. I've been looking for a foundation partner for 2 years, and I have found—" A slight pause, very different from Derek's pauses, nothing worth committing to, until tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to need to prove that's about the foundation," she said. Something shifted in his expression, more like the recognition of a specific kind of person. "I know," he said. They talked for an hour. It was not the polite circling of a fundraising conversation. He asked about the rural expansion in a way that proved he had read the reports, actually read them, not skimmed them, and he pushed back on her funding model in a way that was sharp and precise, and, she had to admit, correct. She pushed back on his pushback. He listened. He adjusted his position. He asked a better question. She couldn't remember the last time someone had changed their mind in front of her without making her feel like it had cost them something. Around the second hour, her foundation's board chair, Margaret Oakefpast, caught Cecily's eye and mouthed something that looked like "Who is that?" with barely concealed interest. Cecily gave a small, helpless shrug. Margaret grinned and kept walking. "Your board chair approves," Callum said without looking away from Cecily. "She approves of anyone who talks to me for this long without looking at their phone." "I put mine on silent." He said it seriously. I was serious about the questions. She laughed, actually laughed, unguarded, the way she almost never did in professional settings. He looked at her for a moment, like he was filing something away. She found out what Callum Vane was when she got home that night and typed his name into her laptop. Callum Vane, founder and CEO of Vane Capital Partners, one of the largest private infrastructure investment firms in the country. Net worth estimated at. She closed the laptop, opened it again. Net worth estimated at $4.2 billion. She sat back in her chair and stared at her ceiling. She thought about the way he had listened, the way he had adjusted, the way he had appeared without announcement when Derek was doing the thing Derek did and had not made a production out of it. She thought about the way he had said you caught yourself. That's different. She thought about how accurately he had seen her in 45 minutes when Derek had spent 3 years looking straight through her. She closed the laptop again. This time she left it closed. He called 2 days later. Not an email, not a text through an assistant. He called from his personal number at 9:14 in the morning, and when she answered he said, "I'd like to schedule a meeting with your operations director and your program lead, and then I'd like to take you to dinner." "Those are 2 separate things," she said. "Yes. The first one is professional." "Yes. And the second one?" A beat. "The second one is because you argued with me about the per-pupil cost model for 6 minutes, and you were right, and I'd like to see what else you're right about." She pressed her fingertip against her desk. "I don't date investors," she said. "I haven't invested yet," he said. "Technically, I'm just a man who reads your annual reports and thinks you're remarkable." She was quiet for 3 seconds. "Tuesday," she said. "Dinner." "Not Wednesday. I have a board call, Tuesday," he agreed, and she could hear, very faintly, that he was smiling. Derek found out about Callum the way people like Derek always found things out, through someone who thought they were being helpful. He called on a Thursday morning. She saw his name on her phone and let it ring twice, then answered because she had learned that not answering Derek Lowe only delayed things. "I heard you've been spending time with Callum Vane," he said. "He's considering a major gift to the foundation, Cecily." His voice had that texture, the careful, concerned texture that meant he was about to say something unkind framed as kindness. "I'm saying this because I genuinely care about you. Men like Callum Vane don't." Another pause. "I just don't want you to get confused about what his interest is." She felt the old compression start in her chest. She waited for it to pass. "What do you think his interest is?" she asked, her voice perfectly even. "You're a smart woman. You run a good program. I'm sure he has legitimate business reasons for being interested in the foundation." Another pause. "I just want you to be clear on what this is, so you don't get hurt." She thought about the way Callum had said you caught yourself. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "Don't call me again." She hung up. Her hands were shaking slightly, but not from hurt, from the specific adrenaline of having said the true thing out loud after a long time of not. She told Callum about it at dinner on Tuesday. She hadn't planned to, but he asked how her week had been, and she found herself telling him, not performing composure about it, just saying it plainly, the way you say things to someone you've started to trust. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his fork and was quiet for a moment. "What did you feel when he said it?" he asked. She thought about lying. "Small," she said, "for about 4 seconds. And then I remembered that I've had the same feeling in the same pause 1,000 times, and I'm tired of it." He nodded. He picked up his fork again. And then he said quietly, without drama, "He's going to find that his access to the Fowler family network has become unexpectedly complicated." She looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "Elaine Fowler's husband sits on the board of a company that's been seeking infrastructure investment for 2 years. I've been in preliminary conversations." He met her eyes. "I've decided to go a different direction with that capital." She stared at him. "Callum, you can't do that. I can do whatever I like with my investment decisions." He said it without heat. "I chose not to invest in a man whose idea of confidence is making other people feel less. That's not about you. That's about my standards." "You're lying," she said. "It's a little bit about me." He looked at her across the table. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened. "Yes," he said. "It's a little bit about you." She went home that night and stood in front of her mirror again, not for 22 minutes this time, just for a moment. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Permission, maybe, the way she'd always been looking for it, from mirrors, from rooms, from the pauses in other people's sentences where they filed their real opinions. She thought about what Callum had said at the gala. "You caught yourself. That's different." She thought about what he hadn't said, but had meant, that catching yourself was the thing, that it accumulated, that it became, eventually, something you didn't have to catch anymore, something that simply held. She had spent 3 years with a man who had made her feel like her value was a favor he was granting her. She had spent 4 years building something real from nothing, reaching 60,000 kids, turning a one-room program into a foundation with its name in grant databases and congressional testimony. And she had still stood in front of this mirror in a beautiful dress and had to talk herself into believing she could walk through a door. She was tired of doing math to prove she was enough. She looked at her reflection. She didn't say anything. She just looked, the way you look at something you've been underestimating. On a Wednesday evening 3 weeks later, Callum appeared at the Foundation's offices, not unannounced. He had texted 15 minutes earlier, "I'm outside if you have time." She had texted back, "Come up," and when he walked in, he was carrying 2 coffees and had the expression of a man who had been thinking about something for several days. She was the only one left in the office. Her team had gone home. He set the coffees on her desk and looked around at the walls. The student artwork, the maps of rural counties, the printed metrics she'd taped up to remind herself what they were doing and why. "This is what 60,000 kids looks like," he said quietly. "That's a conservative estimate." He turned to look at her. The board approved the partnership yesterday, she already knew. Margaret had called her the minute the vote came through. The number Callum's firm was committing was large enough that she had had to sit down, and Margaret had laughed and said, "I told you he was serious." "I know," she said. "I wanted to tell you myself." She looked at him across the desk. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the first time I saw you, you were standing in a room full of people who were looking past you. And you had your chin up anyway, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought, whoever that woman is, she's decided something. I wanted to know what she'd decided." "And," she said finally, "you decided you were worth showing up for," he said, "even when the room hadn't voted on it yet." He picked up his coffee. "I find that." A pause different from any pause she'd ever waited, inside, extraordinary. She held very still. She thought about the dress, about the mirror, about the 22 minutes, about the 4 seconds of small, and the moment after it. "I know," he looked at her, direct and certain. "So am I. I thought we could work on it in the same direction." She picked up her coffee. Outside, the city hummed with the indifferent energy of 10,000 lives happening at once. Inside, the maps on the walls showed all the places where a single reading program had started to matter. 60,000 kids. Conservative estimate. She had built that by showing up when the room hadn't voted on her yet. She thought maybe that was what this was, too. "Same direction," she said, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was arguing herself into something. She just felt sure. He never needed to make her feel large. She had always been. He just had the patience to wait until she remembered.